into the second part of my video lecture on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2. We're going to begin at Chapter 5, work our way through Chapter 9, hopefully. So we start around 1105b, line 19 or so, Chapter 5. After these things, the things we have discussed in our last video lecture from the earlier part of Book 2, after these things, one must examine what virtue is. This is one of the underlying basic questions that Aristotle returns to and comes back to throughout the Nicomachean Ethics. What is happiness? What is virtue? We've already learned that, according to Aristotle, eudaimonia, happiness is to actively realize virtue. According to reason. So, if happiness is to live a virtuous life, is to enact the virtues in practice, what is virtue? Now, since he says there are three kinds of things that come to be present in the soul, this is one approach, I suppose. He's going to say there are three different types of things that come to be present in the soul, and virtue has to be one of those three types of things. So, by a process of elimination, basically, he's going to arrive at his answer to the question what virtue is here. Three types of things come to be present in the soul. Feelings, pathe in Greek, predispositions, dunamis, and active conditions, exes. Virtue is going to be one of these, he says. So let's just think about, and good, he's going to give us examples so that we can think what he means by these. Feelings, right? What does he mean by feelings? I mean desire, anger, fear, confidence, envy, joy, affection, hatred, yearning, jealousy, pity, and generally those things which are accompanied by pleasure or pain. That's, I think, understandable enough. We are familiar with feelings like joy or jealousy, hatred, or affection. Fair enough. Okay, so virtue is not going to be a feeling for Aristotle. So spoiler alert. In any case, it is the predispositions, he says, which are accompanied. It is the predispositions in accordance with which we are said to be apt to feel these. So now he's telling you what predispositions are, and these are going to be our aptness to feel certain feelings, okay? And so some folks are predisposed to feel hatred. We call them today white supremacists, racists in this country, for example. They have a predisposition to feel hatred. It doesn't take much to trigger this in them, and now they're spewing racial epithets at somebody with the saliva flying out of their mouth. It's a predisposition. Likewise, you can also, be predisposed, that is, to affection, right? Maybe you're an affectionate person who enjoys liking other folks and feeling affection towards them, and so this is going to be a sort of predisposition. It doesn't take much for these affectionate feelings to manifest themselves in you in the presence of others or something. So you have this predisposition. That person always likes to give a person a hug when they say hello or something like this. Okay. Predispositions in accordance with which we are said to be apt to feel feelings, such as those by which we are predisposed to be angry, or to be annoyed, or to feel pity. So predispositions are something like our susceptibility, the frequency with which we incline towards certain feelings or other feelings, right? Okay, and it is the active conditions in accordance with which we bear ourselves well or badly toward the feelings. For example, in relation to being angry, if we are that way violently or slackly, that is, if we are predisposed to be angry and it doesn't take much to set us off and our face gets all red and we're ready to go fight, we are violently, you might say, disposed towards anger. You can also slackly be disposed towards anger if it takes a lot to make you angry. A lot, right? Now, Aristotle's example here. For example, he says, in relation to being angry, are we angry violently, or are we angry slackly, as he puts it? Now, if we are that way, we bear ourselves badly. That is, if we fly into a rage over trifles where our anger seems entirely unreasonable and out of proportion to some situation. There's one bad way of being angry. There's another bad way to be angry, according to Aristotle. Slackly. Somebody, it continually outrages a person, and the person does not even get angry, right? This is also, I think, for Aristotle, a bearing of ourselves badly. Now he says, if in a measured way, if we get angry in a measured way, we bear ourselves well. So there's going to be a justified form of anger for Aristotle, right? When somebody does something to you that is wrong, that they should not do, that harms you or puts you in danger, you are justified, and when they're doing that to you, seems to clearly be a case of lack of consideration, right? Not an accident, not, they're not having a medical emergency or something like this. Then, in a situation like that, anger is called for in a measured way, right? Be angry with the wrong that is being done to you by this person, but not with that person, say, insofar as they are a human being or something, right? Wrong. You're upset about what is happening, but you're not necessarily angry that this other person exists or something like that. All right, so active conditions. Virtue is going to be one of these things. It's going to be a feeling. No, it won't be. We know this much. It's not going to be a feeling. Will it be a predisposition or an active condition? That is going to be the question. Now he's going to rule out predispositions, and he's going to say the reason we rule out predispositions here as a candidate for virtue is what precedes here, what you find on the bottom of page 27. People, Aristotle points out, are said to be serious people or trifling in their moral stature, right? And what's more, right, he goes on to say, we are neither praised nor blamed as a result of our feelings. So you don't get praised for feeling some way, you don't get blamed necessarily for having a feeling. He says, but we are praised or blamed as a result of our virtues and vices. And so then what this is going to lead Aristotle to claim here is that because we are praised or blamed as a result of our virtues and vices, clearly then virtue and vice must involve something we are responsible for, something we make choices with reference to. And we don't necessarily, he thinks, make choices as to our feelings, but we do make choices when it comes to what is called active conditions. He says, so let's look at the very bottom, page 27, and on the top of 28, try to follow Aristotle's reasoning here. The virtues and vices are not predispositions, since we are not called good or bad, nor are we praised or blamed, simply for being predisposed to feel something. Okay, and I suppose this is true, right? The mere fact that you would be upset if some injustice were to occur in front of you is not particularly praiseworthy. For one reason, this involves potentiality rather than actuality. That's one way to think about it, right? We're talking about sort of hypotheticals in a sense. He says also, we are predisposed by nature. Now this is another claim that's a bit controversial here, but I guess the idea is something like naturally we have certain predispositions. These predispositions, help explain sort of variety and diversity of human character and of human characters and of our relation to our feelings, right? Some people are quick to anger, others are very slow to anger. Some people anger kind of right in between those extremes. And some folks are quick to be affectionate, other folks are cold and not quick to be affectionate, and then there are folks in between, etc. And Aristotle is claiming these predispositions are natural. And because they're natural, we don't receive praise or blame for them. In the same way, you should not, strictly speaking, you would think you would not be praised for for example, for your stature, right? The fact that you grow to be over 6 feet tall or whatever is not something that somebody would praise you for because you haven't done anything to make that happen. It just naturally occurs. So he says, we are predisposed by nature, yes, and that's why predisposition then is not going to be virtue or vice. We do not become virtuous or vicious according to Aristotle by nature. It takes work on our part to make either of those things happen. So, we do not become good or bad by nature, but we spoke about this before. Great, Aristotle. So we've already discussed this, and he's not wrong. He comes back to these topics again and again. Also, that note, let's see, 32. Ah, good. Joe Sachs has given you the reference here, so go back and have a look at that if you'd like, right? We do not become good or bad by nature. So if the virtues are neither feelings nor predispositions, then they must be active conditions. So by a process of elimination, he arrives at the thesis that virtues are active conditions. They are, and so the difference here between predisposition and active condition is an active condition is something like, let's think about a firefighter who has been well trained. They are then in the active condition where they will display and embody the virtue of courage because of their training. What this means then is, they routinely roll up to a burning home or something like this, dangerous situation, but they are ready to go, that is, ready to fight the fire, to put the fire out, to rescue people, and to save property. And all they need to start showing that virtue of courage in that situation is for a house to be on fire, right? It takes something that is beyond their control, namely a fire. Certainly a fire department or firefighters who would set fires in order to then put them out would not be virtuous. So they have to wait around for fire to occur, and then once that happens, and once they move from the fire station to the site of the fire, this active condition they have to put their lives at risk to save others, to save property, is activated, you could say. So they kind of walk around ready to do this at any time. And so presumably, right, we can imagine a situation where one of these trained firefighters is on vacation with his family, and they are enjoying, let's say, a vacation in Honolulu or something, and suddenly, while they're having, say, some tacos on the beach or something, they see a fire, right? Maybe he sees a fire nearby. Well, this person, even on vacation, even with their family, could then immediately sort of switch into their role as a firefighter and display this virtue again of courage, right? I'm going to put my life at risk and save someone else's life, someone's life who would be lost otherwise. Okay, enough about all that. We move into chapter 6 then. Aristotle now wants to say we have not done enough in identifying virtue as an active condition. We have to also say what sort of active condition we're talking about. So there are different types of active conditions. If you look at the bottom of the first paragraph here on page 28, the first paragraph of chapter 6, virtue of a human being would be the active condition from which one becomes a good human being, and from which one will yield up one's own work well. Okay, so what is this active condition from which one becomes a good human being? And that is, I think, a pressing question that he's going to have to figure out. So what is this active condition? He's going to then spell it out. It's a mean, it's in relation to us. And he says, by a mean that belongs to the thing, I'm speaking of what holds a position equally apart from either of the extremes, which is one and the same thing for everyone, but the mean in relation to us goes neither too far nor falls short. It's not one thing or the same for everyone, right? It's not the same thing, say, for me and for that firefighter. Okay, the mean for that firefighter is going to, be different. That person has training, that person has equipment. I don't. This means that person should do certain things in a situation where there's a fire and lives are at stake that I perhaps should not do. Okay? You can think of this in reference to situations that arise on the beach by the Pacific Ocean here too, right? Is somebody being pulled out by a current? Should you jump in to save them? Well, a lot depends on how well you know how to swim, how familiar you are with the ocean and with currents and riptides and whatnot. If you're not careful, right, you could jump in and lose your own life in addition to this other person drowning, and that would not be virtuous. And so, in other words, the mean that is virtue is going to vary depending on the agent in question. So, moving to the bottom, page 28. Everyone who has knowledge avoids excess and deficiency. Again, virtue has a mean, a middle point between extremes. Everyone who has knowledge avoids excess and deficiency, seeks the mean, and chooses this, but not the mean that belongs to the thing. That is, there is no objective mean that is the same for everyone that would decide this, right? So, for example, this is why, when you look on labels on food that you buy at the grocery store, they can tell you how many calories something has. They can't tell you what percentage of your diet that should be. In other words, they can't tell you where, they can't objectively say for every single person what a healthy serving is, frankly. Why? Because some of us are over 6 feet tall and sometimes weigh over 200 pounds, others don't, right? And then there are children and etc. And so things that what constitutes moderation when it comes to our diet is going to vary depending on our size, our age, and a variety of other factors. That's why you got to go to a doctor and tell them about your own specific situation, right? They have to take your weight, they have to look at your age, etc. Right? They can't just give everybody the same exact advice. And they have knowledge, right? They have knowledge, and yet they can't give everybody the same advice because of that knowledge. Okay. So, virtue then is going to be what allows us to hit this mean point, this middle point between extremes, depending on our own constitution and character. Now, as he puts it here in the middle of page 29, this is a wonderful thought that we really should reflect on. It is possible to go wrong in many ways. This is the difficulty of being virtuous, of enacting virtue. It's easy to make mistakes and do the wrong thing. Says there is only one way to get something right. That's obviously questionable. Clearly, I think that is incorrect, honestly. Only one. I mean, there can be situations where there's only one way to get something right. There can be situations where there might be more than one way to get something right. Nonetheless, his general point that it's harder to get something right than to get it wrong, I think, stands. So for these reasons, excess and deficiency belong to vice. And so he's considering vice or viciousness as either an excess or a deficiency of a virtue. So there's a sense in which virtue is the positive state. It's the middle point between extremes. The negative states are the absence of that middle point as either an excess, way too much of something, or a deficiency. Think of courage, right? Middle point between these extremes of a deficiency, utter deficiency would be cowardice. You have no courage. A tiny little sound in the bushes, maybe it's a mouse or a squirrel, and you're running the other way, never to be seen again. That's absolutely no courage. That is a deficiency, and you run away from anything if there's even a little bit of danger. There's fireworks in the sky, and you jump and take cover. Now, an excess of what we're calling courage is going to be recklessness or rashness or something like this. And that's going to be, the situation where you see somebody in the water and they're screaming for help and you don't know how to swim and yet you still jump in to save them. That's reckless, right? You're trying a little too hard to be a hero. You should have learned how to swim first before trying to save somebody who's drowning, something like that. Okay. So this all leads Aristotle then to sort of summarize where he's at right here. The bottom of page 29, right at 1107a, the beginning of that section. Virtue is an active condition, right? So it's something that we carry around with us, that we have formed in our character, that is ready to be activated should the situation demand it. But should the situation not demand it, it's there and it's ready to go. Virtue is an active condition that makes one apt at choosing. So it helps you make the right decisions in various situations, consisting in a mean condition that is in relation to us and our physical constitution, even, right? How strong are we? How old are we? What are we capable of doing and what are we not capable of doing at a certain point? And this mean condition in relation to us is determined by a proportion Certainly not excess or deficiency, but something sort of equidistant from both. And by the means which a person with practical judgment would determine it. Right? So another way to think of this too is to just think about what a sort of trained professional who's excellent in some domain would do in this situation, right? So if we're in a situation involving fires, then you want to sort of think of what this fire chief or this fire professional that you may have known or something would have done in that situation. Identify somebody with knowledge and skill and learn from them, and then eventually you can even sort of think, what would so-and-so do in this situation? Well, because that person is clearly excellent at what they're doing here, I should do what they do. So, virtue then is a mean condition between two vices. For every virtue, there will be two corresponding vices, one resulting from excess, the other from deficiency. Virtue is also a mean in the sense that the vices of the one sort, fall short. Those of the other sort go beyond it, go beyond what is appropriate, right, both in feelings and in actions. While virtue discovers and chooses the mean, and thus is appropriate in feeling and action. Okay, so let's, follow through Aristotle's example here in chapter 7. I've already put it on the table. Let's just go ahead and briefly review this. Right around 1107b on page 30, near the beginning of chapter 7, Aristotle writes, concerning fear and confidence, the mean condition is courage. People who go to excess, the one who exceeds in fearlessness is without a name. Yeah, that's not wrong, right? Somebody with too much courage has no name, reckless, rash, as I put it, right? Oh, wait, here we go. Sorry. Let's think about this. Hold on. Let us stop and try to think here. Concerning fear and confidence, the mean condition is courage. Yes, the virtue here when it comes to matters of fear and confidence. Should I be afraid? Should I be daring and do something? Right? The mean condition is courage. People who go to excess, sometimes people have too much fearlessness. The one who exceeds fearlessness is without a name. And so, yeah. And I think in a sense, right, somebody who's incapable of fear is what he's getting at. Can we think of somebody who is completely fearless, completely fearless? And I think the reason there's no name for this in Greek, and the reason we don't really have a name for this even in English, is it's incredibly rare. And it would be a kind of cognitive impairment, okay? But this would literally be someone who smells smoke or something inside a house or apartment and doesn't care, right? And is indifferent to things like that. Or, who sees vehicles traveling down the road at a fairly high rate of speed and just kind of walks out into the road, not worried about whether somebody's going to hit him or not. We're much more familiar with what I'm trying to suggest here. Somebody who has too much confidence, is overconfident. We call this recklessness or rashness. Aristotle's distinguishing, right? This kind of having too much confidence from having absolutely no fear. And he's not wrong, right? That there is a subtle difference here. Plenty of us, I know, certainly I'm familiar with many people in my life, in my experience, who have been overconfident and who have gotten what was coming to them eventually, right? Whereas I can only think of maybe a few seriously mentally ill persons I may have known in psychotic states or episodes who would have had this kind of utter fearlessness, right? Somebody who does something that seems insane, right? I'm thinking now of situations in the news from recent years where a person walks into an animal enclosure at a zoo and sort of wants to take a selfie with a lion or a tiger or something like that. Okay, but in any case, when we're talking about a person who's completely fearless, unreasonably, or overly confident, in either case, those are excesses. He says, and the one who exceeds in fearing, but falls short in being confident. So this is, it's a bit, I think, a bit overly particular here. Nonetheless, right, what he's getting at here is a deficiency of confidence here would be cowardice. The right amount of confidence for the situation based on your own sort of background and training and capabilities would thus be courage, right, in between these extremes. Okay, and then he goes on with pleasures and pains. We then talk about the virtue of temperance or moderation. The excess here is dissipation, right? That's drinking and eating fatty, salty and sweet foods to excess, drinking too much alcohol and whatnot. That's dissipation. It leads to terrible health consequences and sluggishness and whatnot. But those, I like this point, those who fall short concerning pleasure don't turn up very often. So it's even rarer than this case of, um, of exceptional fearlessness. Those who fall short concerning pleasure don't turn up very often, for which reason they and their sort have not happened on a name. Again, we have no name for them. Let them be termed insensible, apathetic, or something like this, right? Asexual, and whatnot, right? Folks for whom sensual pleasures are matters of indifference. For Aristotle, he's just not very familiar with such people in ancient Greece at this time, although I think we've become a little bit more familiarized with such folks through a long tradition of kind of monasticism, monastic orders, nunneries and such, right? Getting to know somebody, for instance, who's maybe taken a vow of celibacy and who seems to live a moderate, kind of healthy life for spiritual reasons might not be completely unknown to us, and therefore we might want to think about a person like this maybe a little more sympathetically than just calling them sort of insensible, almost as if they're incapable of having these feelings of pleasure and pain. In any case, it'll be the same over and over, and I'm going to give you one more example. It's the last one we'll look at right here, but concerning giving and taking of money, we have a virtue here. The middle point between extremes, the virtue is going to be called generosity. Excess here is going to be called wastefulness, right? You give so much away you have nothing left for yourself. You end up ruining yourself by being too generous, you might say. Whereas the other extreme of deficiency would be stinginess, right? You never give anything, or you rarely do, and only if forced to, or something like this. So the middle point here would be generosity. Okay. Now, in chapter 9, there's a really interesting discussion here. Again, I just want to we may have covered this before. If not, you certainly have to at least look at this and talk about it. It's a very important passage here when it comes to thinking how this virtue as a mean between extremes, a mean that is relative to each one of us and in the situation we're in, but as well as also our, how our character has been formed, how we have formed our own character, how we have produced these active conditions in ourselves to display virtues. So let's look at chapter 9, and then we're going to end here with this discussion of chapter 9. So I want to look at this line of poetry that Aristotle cites on the top of page 35, just above 1109b. So in 1109a, around line 30, 31, 32. But I want to back up a little bit, a few lines ahead of that, and just kind of just think about what Aristotle's up to here. So, here, let's just look at his advice right here on the top of 35. Hence the one who aims at the mean. So any one of us living our lives, trying to do various things for various reasons, ultimately trying to be happy and live a fulfilling life, and realize the excellence that we are potentially capable of, make it real. Now, the one, any one of us thus, right, who aims at the mean ought first to pull back from what is more contrary to it. Now he's imagining, and this metaphor here is going to be an archery metaphor. And, each one of us thus is like an archer aiming our bow, trying to shoot arrows at a target. Incidentally, the target moves. It's a moving target. And we're trying to hit the bullseye. Now, he says, the one who aims at the mean ought first to pull back from what is more contrary to it. And so there's a sense in which he's imagining, right? Virtue is a bullseye target you're aiming at with bow and arrow. Now, on each side of that target, there are going to be the vices, right? If the bullseye target is the virtue, the vices are on each side. And the idea is each of these vices, they're not equivalent. One of them is worse than the other. So let's imagine, right? You have a bullseye target, and then let's say over here in the one vice, let's say you have, instead of a bullseye target that you hit with your arrow, you have a little kitten. Don't want to kill an innocent little kitten. That would be a bad thing to do. However, on the other side, the other vice would be something like you have a little infant human child or something, right? Now it's clearly, these are not equivalent. As bad as it would be to hit a kitten with your bow and arrow, it would be even worse to hit a human infant or something. The idea being both bad, one worse than the other. You could make a case that all life deserves to be respected equally, etc. I don't want to problematize this too much. I'm trying to stick with this kind of metaphor and have you imagine you want to hit the bullseye target, right? But if you're going to miss, Aristotle's saying here, if you're going to miss, and you might miss, right? There's wind, there's the fact that you've been practicing shooting this bow and arrow, but you might not, have practiced as much as you needed to. In other words, you're going to try to hit the target, and maybe the target's moving around a bit. It's a moving target. But you also have to avoid missing, right? It turns out missing the target is not always the same thing, not always equally bad. There are better and worse ways to miss, right? And so you have to identify, for any situation, for any virtue in question, right, there are going to be two corresponding vices, excess and deficiency. You have to identify not just what these vices are, right, but which one is a worse vice, which is the worse evil, which is the lesser evil. And he's saying then, when you aim at the target, aim in such a way that you pull back from what is more contrary to it. Right? So aim in such a way that if you do miss, you'll be much more likely to hit the lesser evil. Right? Aim in that direction. Aim at the target, but such that if you miss, you are missing in the direction of the lesser evil. Since then, he says, so now he's going to say, right, as Calypso advises, keep the ship out beyond that thick spray and swell, right? Calypso here advising, giving advice on how to navigate between Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla and Charybdis now become a metaphor for any situation where, it's a metaphor now drawn from sailing and navigation, right? But there are situations where you have to go in between two dangers. And if you go too far to the right or left, you're going to be destroyed one way or another. And so you have to sort of do this middle path in between, right? So, one of the extremes is a greater error, the other a lesser. Figure out which is the greater error, figure out which is the lesser error, and then make sure that if you miss your target, you miss on the side of the lesser error. Since then, to hit the mean with extreme precision is a difficult thing, the second best way to sail is to take the least of the evils, right? And this will be most the case in the way we are speaking of. So incline towards the lesser evil. Also, he says, one ought to consider what we are ourselves carried away toward, right? And so now we have to look at our own selves, so now it's not just about identifying the vices and figuring out which one is the lesser one, and making sure that if we miss in that direction, so to speak. We have to also look at ourselves, take a sort of self-inventory, figure out, what our predisposition is here. If we're predisposed towards a certain vice, maybe it's the lesser evil, and we're predisposed towards it, we actually would have to correct the other way then. Because we have this predisposition, it operates something like the wind direction and wind force. It operates in that manner if we're going to follow through on this archery metaphor. And so we bring a sort of distortion into this by being predisposed towards certain vices. Some of us, for instance, with courage, might be predisposed towards being reckless or rash. Others might be predisposed towards being cowardly. In which case, you would have to incline toward the other vice to make sure that you're closer to hitting the virtue, according to Aristotle. Right? So if you're inclined, for example, to run away from all danger and ask questions later about whether it was real or not, you should then incline towards rashness or fearlessness or something like this to correct for your own vicious predisposition. Finally, in everything, he says, one must guard most against the pleasant thing and against pleasure. So here's a kind of universal rule that he wants to apply and say, despite all of the variations in our nature and the differences in stature and strength and our differences in our backgrounds and our education and all kinds of things, despite all that, one sort of general truth is most folks are inclined towards whatever is more pleasurable and inclined away from whatever is more painful. And Aristotle's advice here is, pleasure seems to function thus like something offering us a bribe. And we have to, says, in exactly the way the town elders felt toward Helen, we ought to feel toward pleasure. Think it over in every instance what they said. For by sending it off in that way, we shall go astray less. And if you look down here, right, the old men of Troy say, in effect, let her beauty exert its power somewhere else. She's too beautiful for our community, so let her go to Troy and let her beauty cause trouble over there or something like that. And so what he's saying is here is with pleasure, you should think of pleasure as Helen of Troy and say, you know what, it's amazing, she's beautiful, incredible, but it's too much trouble. You're safer avoiding this impulse towards feeling pleasure. So in other words, something like, we're all inclined, in a sense, we're predisposed to choose things that are pleasurable and avoid things that are painful, and that can function to make us less capable of doing the right thing in various situations. We have to recognize that and counteract it ourselves. Okay, I think we've said enough for today about the second part of Book 2 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Thanks for joining me.